Thanks for the invitation. I will try to keep it quite, short today. The idea for this presentation came from the fact, as Marie said, I have quite transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary background in human factors and engineering, safety, and quality management. And we know that in modern human factors and ergonomics, we now see human variability and performance variability not always as a problem, but also as a source of success. So people, need to adapt to the environment, and they are the ones that will complete the design, as we say, meaning that the particular imperfections that we might have in our systems, we rely on people still to close those gaps. The presentation today, it's conceptual, it's not technical. I'm not going to present you any formulas or any research findings and studies. And actually is based on a book I recently published based on this transdisciplinary background I have, which I call it professional generalism. It's very much inspired by human factors and safety and quality management engineering. And it was a journey that took me about 3 years to put those concepts together. I'm not introducing any new theories today on in this book. It's more about putting together concepts from different disciplines in a more inclusive approach. So as I said before, the shift in epistemology in human factors is like we do not see the user, the individual, the human as a cog in the machine anymore, and we respect that people have different needs and wants, and how they interact with each other and with the sociotechnical systems, it can vary. And the complexity of those systems makes it a bit more difficult for people to adapt and understand the system. We make mistakes while dealing with those systems that we not sometimes understand very well. We might make the wrong decisions, but most of the times we are still performing very well and successfully. So that's why in the modern human factors and ergonomics, let's say school, the new tradition, that the mainstream human factors is that we see people indeed as variable components in the system, but this doesn't mean always that is bad news. The people at the same time, they provide this operational flexibility that we need. Now, to start from the beginning, when we're talking about socio-technical systems, we're talking about many elements, the social part, which is humans, and then infrastructure, equipment, and the physical environment that we exist in. Human factors and ergonomics traditionally deal with interactions between people and other people in the environment. So in this graph, you can see I just have a generic term, unity, entity. This is the human for us today, that they actually exchange energy. So they interact, or we can have some individuals getting exposed to an element of the environment, or actually sending energy, so exposing other people to their own behavior, for example. So a system, a sociotechnical system, consists of all those unidirectional and bidirectional flows, which we cannot always control, we cannot always predict, but at least mapping those is a very first important step towards doing any, let's say, intervention or planning for any change. If we do not understand within a system who interacts with whom or what, and how people are exposed to the actions and behaviors or technical elements of the environment, then we cannot even, start discussing about changes and improvements. Now, another area that adds to complexity and is not very recognized in human factors is what we call affection, emotion. So in this graph, you see this unity A, you see 3 areas: material energy, cognitive energy, defective energy. Those are terms that I'm using and I define in the book. So, but the message here is that usually we conflate cognition with affection. And if we look in literature, especially over the last 10, 20 years, we see that emotions and mental features, cognition, are quite different entities and features, meaning that somebody can be mentally okay, can have the cognitive capacity to understand things. This doesn't mean that they feel okay. Or they might feel bad about something, but at the same time have the mental capacity and cognitive capability to deal with the situation. However, now, because emotion, cognition, and our bodily functions, our physical and material energy interact, so within the human, this creates a complexity. So from a biomechanical, biophysical, and bioethics and human factors, every perspective, every lens somebody wants to adopt, we're very complex organisms, we're very complex creatures. So the complexity starts from within. The same, so the unity, so the same, the person, as I said before. Then another layer to understanding system is that how people use the energy, how we interact with the environment. The simplest activity type is reaction. So people just receive a stimulus and react to that with no other, let's say, further activity. The second level is they react and then they self-change. So they adapt, they understand that they have to, in order to survive, in order to perform, in order to meet some objectives, reaction to incoming information and stimuli is not enough. So I need to change, I need to adapt. And the third activity type, the third level of this activity type is about transforming others. So not just reacting and self-changing, but also trying to transform the environment and influence, whether that's human or we use material energy to shape, to create machines, to design, systems, procedures, and the like. So those are the three elements. And we cannot expect that people will uniformly manifest any of those activity types at the specific time and space always. Or they will always react to the same situation. Sometimes they will react and then adapt. Sometimes they will decide to adapt after reacting, but they don't want to change anything further. But the worst case scenario is when we try to change, to transform others without us having actually adapted ourselves very well, changed well to the environment. In a few words, there is a cost there of the energy investment. So if we have a poorly designed system, then and people need to react to problems all the time, things they will deplete the physical, cognitive, and affective reserves that they have. Then the fact that we have this expectation that people have to adapt to our system, that's because this is the system, this is the given reality, is a default expectation that we place on people when our systems are in flexion. But this, again, requires energy, it requires changes in their neurons, in the way they view the system, the way they react with the system, we interact with the system. And we underestimate, again, that we deplete those reserves of physical, cognitive, and emotional, pool, the energy. Then if people are already in a situation that they have low capacity, low energy levels, and we try to transform the environment, to impose changes on them, then no doubt we're gonna see resistance and we need to provide more support. All those means that still in the human factors and ergonomics and in the wider management, human resources and management areas in safety and quality, we have not approached people always as complex systems by themselves. We talk about complexity in our systems and about trying to make sense of our systems and how people react with the other elements of the systems. But we tend to forget that people themselves are quite complex and we cannot always expect of them when to react, when to adapt, and when they can be transformed. To add an extra layer to complexity, we have each one of us a motivational envelope. So we have this envelope with I say between the minimum energy that we need to survive as humans, and then the desired energy, what we want from life, what we want from our work, what we want from the society, what we want from others, what we want from ourselves. And inevitably, when we interact with others, those minimums and those desires, this envelope that we have, is compared. And then we say, why do I accept less energy than others have? Why I desire more than others? Why is my envelope shorter and more narrow than others? And these comparisons that we do in our systems go beyond the understanding that we have how an individual interacts with the system. We do not just interact with the system. When it comes to social interactions, we compare ourselves to the system. We compare ourselves to our peers. We have aspirations for a promotion. We want to move to the next step of our career within the same system. And again, those are elements that nowadays we know nothing today, nothing I'm presenting today is new. Everything is in the literature. Everything is knowledge that we can access. But we fail to put things together and shape a better, more holistic understanding of how humans within systems actually are placed before we try to understand complexity itself. So this brings me to the main topic of the main title of the presentation about differences and gaps. So we know that none of us is identical to another person, and we have variabilities and disparities. So the same patient can be a different patient next day. We do not perform exactly the same on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And also we can have people in the same environment, under the same conditions, more or less of same background, and still perform in a different way. So this is something that we already know and we respect. However, in hindsight, those variabilities become differences and gaps. So differences and gaps are constructs, is something we realize after the fact. So we see that my performance is lower than the performance of somebody else. I see that I am tall, somebody is shorter. So those are differences and natural variation. The problem is when those differences became so big and they exceed some thresholds. And then we create gaps in our systems and distances between what we believe that people can do, what we believe that our system can afford, and what we believe, for example, that somebody can produce. And those gaps between the ideal and the actual system, although we have the difference and we say we need diversity, we equity and diversity and inclusion, DEI. On the other hand, if this diversity creates gaps into the system, then those gaps can become detrimental. So there is another level to the complexity here that we have to to balance between how much of variability we accept within a system and how much of this variability can be catastrophic for the system. So this is a graph which I cannot explain in 1 minute, but I want to show some areas that I drew based on the individual, the interactions of the individual with the environment. So at the top of this graph, you see a box here. It is, let's say, the red box. It's the environment. So we have something, a situation we need to manage. We have some objectives we need to meet. We have the time factor, and then we have the environmental variability. So changes, whether that's about the nature, the number of the changes, the speed of the changes, or the magnitude of the changes. So all of this together is the external environment of the patient that needs to, we invite to manage. And how the patient manages, we have the material, cognitive, and affective space within the patient. And we have the demands from this system that we impose on the patient, and then we have the capacity of this patient. And we create those negative or positive balances between the physical, the cognitive, and the affective space. Now, imagine again that those three spaces interact with each other. They're not independent from each other. When somebody feels physically ill, then the cognitive part is affected and the mood, the emotions are negative. When somebody is quite motivated and happy, then mental clarity can be, improved, and the same happens with our bodily reaction. And under this now negative or positive balance, we can support the individuals either with material support or with some cognitive support or with some affective support to give to those people the to increase the capability and the capacity of those people to deal with the situation. But this support is not always given. This support is not always there because we underestimate how all of those elements on the top of this graph, this box with the red variables, affect the patient and how the patient feels about that, how the patient tries to cope. And we again forget that the patient Nektarios of Monday is not exactly the Nektarios of Tuesday. The Nektarios of 8 a.m. in the morning is not the Nektarios of 10 p.m. in the night. But we still design the system with the assumption that people will interact with the system as a uniform creature with uniform performance, and that they will meet the objectives that we have agreed, and that we know that they can meet because they have the qualifications and the training and the competencies. And the complexity, I go back, is if we now look into the human, into the individual. I don't have the time to go through these steps, but we see from cognitive ergonomics. And again, this graph encapsulates quite a few concepts, not from purely ergonomics perspective and cognitive psychology, that we have gaps within the system, within the same person. So we receive data, but we reject data. So the data that we process is not the data we receive. And then we perceive data, and from the data we perceive, we do not trust everything. So we reject again things. We do not act on part of this data because we don't trust. And from the data that we trust, then, and we try to make sense, to model, the environment and comprehend the environment, then after understanding what is happening, we might decide not to act or to make a decision or not to make a decision. If we want to make a decision, then we compare strategies. And the spectrum of the strategies we compare is limited. And so we have a gap between the possible number in hindsight that Marie would say Nektarios, you should consider 20 strategies or 5, but I didn't have the capacity to do that. And I consider just 2 of them. And then I prefer a strategy and I compare the activities. I have the optimization. Humans, we are very efficient creatures. We try to optimize many things every day. So no wonder that sometimes we expect that operator will follow a procedure from A, B, C, D, F, G, but when they have the opportunity, because they are depleted again, they have energy, low energy levels, we find the best way, the shortcut. The shortcut is no wonder. The shortcut is a result of a person that doesn't have the material, cognitive, and emotional energy and, interacting again among them to perform within the environment in the way that is expected. They have to find a way to do the job, to perform the standard with, the best way that they can find. And so if we put those together, imagine that we have the person that's the top left. So all those complexities within the system, with our system, the way we think, the way we feel, the way we filter out things, and the bottom right, how we interact with the environment and whether we receive support and whether this support is good quantity and if it's timely provided or whether that's a good quantity. And this is what actually feeds into what we call complexity. People do not make sense of the system, not because we are not capable, because we design the systems in a way that we don't appreciate the complexity of the individual themselves and the fact that there will always be variabilities and gaps in our systems because the individuals are not machines, are not robots. So we need to appreciate all those heuristics, all those shortcuts. We call heuristics biases all the time. When things go right, we call them heuristics, the shortcuts. When things do not go okay, we call them bias. That's double standards. And we do that, in our language, sometimes in human factors also. And we should be more careful. And it's good and positive that we acknowledge that the system design needs to support people, but not just people, need to support this variability, needs to support intuition. We need to, at the same time, make systems that can contain errors, of course, and afford adaptability. But of course, this does not mean that we do not have responsible and accountable individuals. And we need to find this balance between how much we can accept as a variability, but we need to accept some variability, and how much of that we need actually to control. Differences will exist out there everywhere, within teams, within groups, within departments. We have interpersonal and professional differences. Those are not negatives. We know from literature that homogeneous teams are vulnerable to systemic blind spots. We know that diversity is beneficial for decision making, but let's go to the other hand again. When those differences can, become so big and the gaps become unmanageable, then we have the opposite effect. And this, why on one hand we say we should have, diversity of opinion and background, and this is a power, and this, if we exceed the threshold, then we add complexity to the system. We add gaps to the system because people cannot communicate, because people are so different from each other. They cannot agree. They cannot get on the same page. They cannot develop a shared understanding. And we put them to work together in safety critical, for example, tasks. So variability can be indeed a catalyst for innovation. people need to be stretched at some point so that to develop this adaptability and resilience, but we cannot break people down because we say this is the system and we assume that each one of you will perform at a specific level every day and every minute. We don't care about how you feel. We don't care about your needs. We don't care about your desires. We don't care about how you compare yourself to others, what aspirations you have. And variability, it is the test of the system. It is actually what will define the boundaries of the system and the operational resilience. And I will just spend 2-3 minutes more. When we start intervening in any system, we need to start from the proximal environment. So we need to understand, analyze, and map what interactions and exposure people have in the environment and how this can add to the level of complexity and how this can deplete their energy levels. But we should not forget that this is what we see. There are distant environments that influence each one of us. We cannot isolate the person within the organization, for example, system, whether that's my university or a power plant, from what is happening 15,000 kilometers away. People watch the news. People follow social media. People have family problems. People are part of the community. So another problem when we try to intervene is that we do not approach humans as social entities and social beings. We try to see within our system what goes wrong and what goes well and how we can leverage capacities and how we can improve the system. And we forget the influences of those distant environments. So we need to see not just the technical part, not just the cognitive and features and knowledge and information and processing and the physical and biomechanical aspects of people. We need to match capacity in a more holistic way, in a more sustainable way. We introduce, for example, new technologies, robots, cobots, AI, automation, and people need to adapt to those, and they need time and energy to do that. And we underestimate the toll that all those changes can take on people. We also underestimate that in the same system, you have people that will suck energy from others, and we have, fortunately, people that will donate their energy to others. And we need to find those, which I call energy sponsors, those ambassadors, those that we call sometimes mentors or, coach, that will be there to support others in that journey of adaptation, in that journey of coping with variability. But we need to be mindful that we'll have people in the environment that they're selfish, the ones that they call energy antagonists, that they will go against system changes and design that will be, helpful and will decrease this complexity within our systems. So I have one slide here. We'll share the slides later on, Marie, if you want, with the group. I don't have the time to go into detail. Because the message on that slide is that we need to be consistent in our interventions to align what we sense, what we know, what we monitor with what we change. Sometimes we monitor one element and we try to change the system, which is inconsistent. Other times we sense a system level behavior and we try to fix elements. So this table here actually suggests ways that we can align and we can match where we focus with what areas we need to intervene and what options we have, whether that's to reorganize the system, to replace or remove entities from the system to redesign, to alter, to improve, or just to maintain. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't go too far away, too much over time. I'm
No,
happy to
that was
have
great.
a second session.
Yeah, that was just super, Nektarios, because some of these things intuitively we know them, but to see them all there is extraordinary. Just the cost of that energy that we spend adapting to really poorly designed systems. So I work in healthcare, and I think it's
Oh,
very obvious in healthcare, just the toll that takes on people constantly trying to adapt to poorly designed systems, and that the default position is you ask the person to change, not redesign the system. And so no, I just love that. I thought that was fascinating. Now I'll definitely be buying your book. Not that that's what today was about, but I'm really keen to
no, no,
read
no.
more. Yeah.